In the suffocating, blood-soaked summer of August 1942, the agonizing geopolitical reality of the Second World War was that the Allied forces were mathematically, violently losing the global conflict on virtually every single catastrophic front. Deep within the freezing, pulverized ruins of the Eastern Front, Joseph Stalin's Red Army was being systematically, ruthlessly butchered by the unstoppable, mechanized terror of the German Wehrmacht, prompting the deeply paranoid Soviet dictator to furiously demand the immediate violent opening of a second military front in Western Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had only just begun to mobilize its massive, overwhelming industrial might, leaving the beleaguered British Empire to face the suffocating, terrifying pressure of proving to their desperate allies that they were still physically capable of striking a lethal blow against Adolf Hitler's seemingly impenetrable fortress Europe. Operating from the claustrophobic subterranean depths of Whitehall, the incredibly ambitious and highly controversial Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, began meticulously architecting a spectacularly violent, high-stakes military gamble designed to violently shatter the myth of German coastal invincibility. This desperate, mathematically flawed strategic necessity would ultimately give birth to Operation Jubilee, a colossal, heavily armed amphibious assault that would tragically mutate into one of the most horrific, cold-blooded, and deeply controversial mechanized slaughters in the entire history of the British Armed Forces. The absolute terrifying epicenter chosen for this unprecedented amphibious experiment was the picturesque, heavily fortified French coastal resort town of Dieppe, a location that represented a completely unforgiving, mathematically suicidal geographical nightmare for an invading infantry force. Flanked on both sides by towering, sheer white chalk cliffs that provided the deeply entrenched German defenders with absolute godlike panoramic visibility over the entire operational theatre, the primary assault beaches were not composed of soft sand, but of large, treacherous chert shingles that would instantly paralyze tank treads and violently shatter the ankles of sprinting soldiers. Unknown to the deeply arrogant, tragically optimistic British intelligence apparatus, the German military had spent months systematically transforming the town into a claustrophobic, impenetrable concrete killing zone, meticulously positioning heavy anti-tank artillery, overlapping fields of rapid-fire MG-42 machine guns, and heavily camouflaged sniper nests directly into the face of the cliffs. The German defenders, belonging to the battle-hardened 302nd Infantry Division, were heavily dug into subterranean bunker networks that were completely impervious to light naval gunfire, patiently waiting to unleash a terrifying, apocalyptic crossfire that was mathematically engineered to violently annihilate any amphibious force the absolute second the landing ramps dropped into the freezing, blood-stained surf. To execute this highly experimental, profoundly catastrophic frontal assault, the British High Command ruthlessly selected the men of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, a magnificent, fiercely proud but entirely untested fighting force that had been aggressively training in the muddy fields of the United Kingdom for over 2 agonizing years. These young, highly motivated Canadian soldiers were deeply, suffocatingly frustrated by their prolonged, humiliating lack of combat action, constantly watching from the sidelines while their British and Australian counterparts bled and died across the global theatres of North Africa and Asia. Mountbatten and the British strategic architects cynically capitalized on this desperate, blinding hunger for battlefield glory, officially designating the Canadians as the primary disposable shock troops who would be violently hurled directly into the teeth of the German concrete meat grinder. For decades following the apocalyptic slaughter, a dark, deeply unsettling and fiercely debated historical question would violently haunt the Canadian national consciousness. Were these brave, eager soldiers deliberately, coldly sacrificed by the aristocratic British military establishment as heavily armed experimental guinea pigs to test the terrifying, impenetrable defenses of Hitler's Atlantic Wall without risking the precious lives of their own British infantrymen? The sheer, staggering arrogance and catastrophic tactical negligence of the operational blueprints for Operation Jubilee remain completely, utterly incomprehensible to modern military historians, representing a breathtaking masterclass in bureaucratic hubris and mathematical suicide. In a deeply flawed, desperately tragic attempt to preserve the vital port infrastructure of Dieppe for future strategic use, the British High Command explicitly, categorically refused to authorize a massive, preliminary heavy naval bombardment or a saturation aerial bombing campaign to pulverize the German concrete bunkers before the infantry arrived. Instead, they authorized a terrifyingly light, mathematically useless covering fire from small destroyers, essentially ordering thousands of heavily burdened Canadian infantrymen and the brand new, completely untested Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment to launch a blind, unarmored frontal charge directly into a fully intact, heavily fortified enemy stronghold. The entire fragile success of this colossal military gamble rested exclusively on the absolute, mathematically improbable element of total tactical surprise, a desperate, profoundly naive hope that thousands of men and hundreds of ships could somehow silently sneak across the heavily patrolled, heavily mined English Channel and violently materialize on the French coastline before the ruthless German gunners could pull their triggers. As the freezing, pitch-black night of August 18th slowly bled into the apocalyptic early morning hours of August 19th, 1942, a massive silent armada of over 250 Royal Navy vessels, carrying over 6,000 heavily armed Allied troops, desperately cut through the dark, choppy waters of the English Channel toward their impending doom. Deep within the cramped, suffocatingly claustrophobic metal bellies of the landing craft, thousands of Canadian soldiers gripped their Lee Enfield rifles with white-knuckled, paralyzing terror, violently seasick and entirely oblivious to the apocalyptic mechanized slaughter that was currently waiting for them just beyond the horizon. But at exactly 3:48 a.m., the absolute, fragile linchpin of the entire operation was violently, catastrophically shattered when the eastern flank of the approaching British invasion fleet accidentally collided with a heavily armed German coastal convoy operating in the dark. A sudden, terrifyingly violent naval firefight instantly erupted, lighting up the pitch-black sky with blinding tracer fire and violently destroying the indispensable element of surprise, giving the deeply entrenched German defenders on the cliffs of Dieppe the agonizing, fatal minutes they needed to completely power up their heavy artillery, rack the bolts of their machine guns, and wait in cold, calculating silence for the Canadian slaughter to begin. As the terrifying, blinding flashes of naval tracer fire violently erupted across the pitch-black eastern horizon, the catastrophic, mathematical reality of the Dieppe Raid was permanently sealed before a single Canadian boot had even touched the blood-stained French shingle. The brief, chaotic naval skirmish between the British invasion fleet and the heavily armed German coastal convoy completely annihilated the absolute fragile linchpin of the entire operation, total tactical surprise. High atop the towering, sheer white chalk cliffs overlooking the picturesque coastal town, the battle-hardened veterans of the German 302nd Infantry Division were violently awakened by the deafening roar of naval artillery, instantly abandoning their barracks and sprinting to their heavily fortified, subterranean concrete bunkers. They meticulously racked the bolts of their terrifying rapid-fire MG-42 machine guns, dialed in the coordinates of their heavy anti-tank artillery directly onto the designated landing zones, and waited in cold, calculating, and heavily armored silence for the encroaching armada to emerge from the morning mist. Deep within the suffocating, claustrophobic metal bellies of the approaching landing craft, the thousands of young, completely untested Canadian infantrymen remained tragically, blissfully ignorant of the apocalyptic, mechanized meat grinder that was currently powering up and locking onto their exact coordinates, believing they were about to execute a brilliant, stealthy commando raid against a sleeping, unprepared enemy. When the heavy steel ramps of the landing craft finally violently slammed down into the freezing, waist-deep surf of the designated red and white beaches at exactly 5:20 a.m., the completely exposed, heavily burdened soldiers of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment stepped directly into a synchronized, apocalyptic wall of flying lead. The German defenders, operating from perfectly concealed, heavily overlapping fields of fire carved directly into the towering cliff faces and the fortified casino overlooking the promenade, unleashed a terrifying, ungodly torrent of machine gun fire and high-explosive mortar rounds that instantly turned the shoreline into a chaotic, mechanized slaughterhouse. Hundreds of brave, terrified Canadian soldiers were violently, instantly cut down before they could even physically disembark from the metal ramps, their heavy equipment dragging their bleeding, shattered bodies down into the dark, suffocating depths of the English Channel. Those who miraculously managed to sprint out of the freezing water immediately encountered the catastrophic, mathematically unforgiving geographical nightmare of the Dieppe beach. Millions of smooth, shifting chert stones that violently shattered the ankles of sprinting men, completely neutralizing any desperate attempt at a rapid tactical infantry charge and forcing the surviving soldiers to crawl on their stomachs through a terrifying, inescapable crossfire of tracer rounds. The absolute apocalyptic desperation of the pinned-down Canadian infantry was immediately violently compounded by the catastrophic, humiliating failure of their highly touted, heavily armored support column. The massive 30-ton Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment, explicitly designed to violently smash through the German concrete barricades and provide a rolling wall of impenetrable steel for the advancing troops, arrived catastrophically late to the slaughter and were instantly paralyzed by the exact same shifting, treacherous church shingles that were currently trapping the infantry. As the heavy steel treads of the tanks desperately tried to grip the loose stones, the rocks violently jammed into the drive sprockets, snapping the massive tracks and instantly rendering the magnificent state-of-the-art war machines completely, mathematically immobile on the exposed beachhead. Transformed into stationary, highly visible steel pillboxes, the crippled Churchill tanks became irresistible, magnetic targets for the deeply entrenched German anti-tank gunners, who systematically, ruthlessly pounded the paralyzed armor with armor-piercing artillery shells until the tanks violently brewed up into towering, suffocating pillars of toxic black smoke and burning diesel fuel, leaving the terrified infantry completely, hopelessly abandoned to face the relentless, mechanized fury of the Atlantic Wall, armed with nothing but bolt-action rifles, trapped in a claustrophobic, inescapable kill zone between the freezing, blood-soaked surf and a heavily fortified concrete seawall draped in thick, impenetrable layers of razor-sharp barbed wire. The surviving Canadian soldiers were subjected to hours of agonizing, systematic, and entirely uncontested psychological and physical torture. The German mortar teams, completely safe within their subterranean cliff-top bunkers, meticulously and mathematically dropped hundreds of high-explosive shells vertically down onto the tightly packed, desperately huddled clusters of bleeding men pressed against the seawall, transforming the narrow strip of beach into a terrifying, percussive symphony of flying shrapnel and severed limbs. In a catastrophic, deeply tragic failure of military communication that would permanently haunt the legacy of the British High Command, the heavily encrypted radio sets carried by the Canadian forward observers were violently shattered by enemy fire or completely drowned in the surf, creating an impenetrable, suffocating fog of war. Aboard the command ship HMS Calpe, cruising miles offshore in relative ignorant safety, Major General Roberts received fragmented, wildly inaccurate reports from the smoke-covered beaches, tragically leading him to the deeply flawed, catastrophic conclusion that the vanguard had successfully breached the town, prompting him to ruthlessly, blindly order his precious, heavily armed reserve battalions to sail directly into the exact same apocalyptic meat grinder. As the suffocating, brilliantly sunny morning slowly dragged on, illuminating the sheer, staggering scale of the mechanized butchery unfolding on the French coastline, the agonizing, undeniable reality of Operation Jubilee finally crashed down upon the completely paralyzed British command structure. The pristine white chalk cliffs of Dieppe stood completely, arrogantly unblemished, while the picturesque, shifting chert beaches below had literally, physically, turned a dark, sickening shade of crimson, choked with the twisted, burning wreckage of paralyzed Churchill tanks and the mutilated, lifeless bodies of nearly 1,000 young Canadian men. Small, completely isolated pockets of desperate, heroic infantrymen had miraculously managed to scale the sheer cliffs or violently breach the fortified casino using nothing but bayonets and raw, unadulterated adrenaline, but they were quickly, systematically hunted down and brutally exterminated by the overwhelming, heavily coordinated counterattacks of the German reserves. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the agonizing, mathematically impossible objective of capturing the port had completely evaporated, violently replaced by a frantic, terrifying, and deeply humiliating scramble to execute a chaotic mass naval evacuation before the completely unchecked, highly lethal squadrons of the German Luftwaffe could arrive to permanently, violently annihilate the trapped, bleeding remnants of the 2nd Canadian Division from the skies. As the suffocating, smoke-filled morning of August 19th violently dragged toward the agonizing hour of 9 o'clock, the catastrophic, undeniable reality of the mechanized slaughter on the French coastline finally, permanently shattered the deeply flawed, optimistic illusions of the British High Command. Aboard the command destroyer HMS Calpe, Major General John Roberts was utterly paralyzed by a terrifying, fragmented influx of desperate, blood-soaked radio transmissions that painted a picture of absolute, unmitigated apocalyptic ruin across the sprawling chert beaches of Dieppe. The majestic, heavily armored Churchill tanks were violently burning, the pristine white cliffs were completely, arrogantly unbreached, and the magnificent vanguard of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was being systematically, ruthlessly exterminated by an impenetrable, deeply entrenched wall of German heavy artillery. Faced with the agonizing, mathematically impossible task of capturing a fortified port that had instantly mutated into an inescapable concrete meat grinder, Roberts was forced to make the most horrifying, stomach-churning military decision of his entire career. He issued the catastrophic, deeply humiliating order to immediately initiate Operation Vanquish, a frantic, desperate mass naval evacuation designed to blindly snatch whatever shattered, bleeding remnants of his destroyed army he could physically pull from the jaws of the Atlantic Wall before the tide went out and permanently sealed their doom. The absolute terrifying execution of this desperate naval withdrawal instantly transformed the blood-stained, choppy waters of the English Channel into a sprawling, apocalyptic maritime slaughterhouse of unprecedented proportions. As the brave, highly vulnerable flotilla of unarmored Royal Navy landing craft frantically reversed course and charged directly back into the blinding, saturated crossfire of the German coastal batteries, the terrifying mechanical drone of the Luftwaffe violently descended from the skies. Squadrons of lethal, heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190 fighters and Dornier dive bombers aggressively swarmed the exposed rescue fleet, relentlessly strafing the wooden decks with heavy machine gun fire and dropping high-explosive ordnance directly onto the tightly packed, suffocating clusters of desperate men. High above the burning, pulverized beaches, the Royal Air Force engaged in a massive, swirling and deeply chaotic aerial dogfight to protect the retreating armada, losing over 100 Spitfires and Hurricanes in a desperate, heroic attempt to maintain a fragile umbrella of air superiority. But down on the surface of the freezing, crimson-stained surf, the German anti-tank gunners simply lowered their massive artillery barrels and systematically, ruthlessly, began blowing the incoming rescue boats entirely out of the water, turning the designated evacuation vectors into floating, burning graveyards of twisted metal and shattered limbs. For the thousands of pinned-down, exhausted Canadian infantrymen desperately clinging to the razor-sharp barbed wire of the seawall, the arrival of the evacuation fleet triggered a terrifying, chaotic, and profoundly agonizing physical scramble for survival. In order to physically reach the metal ramps of the bobbing landing craft, the bleeding, shell-shocked soldiers were forced to abandon the fragile, inadequate cover of the chert embankment and launch a blind, suicidal sprint directly across the fully exposed, mathematically registered kill zones of the German MG-42 machine guns. Men violently stripped off their heavy canvas webbing, their steel helmets, and their jammed Lee Enfield rifles, plunging into the freezing, oil-slicked surf in a frantic, desperate attempt to swim toward the retreating boats, while heavy artillery shells erupted like massive, suffocating geysers all around them. The sheer, staggering heroism displayed in this apocalyptic maelstrom was deeply heartbreaking, as wounded soldiers desperately dragged their mutilated, unconscious comrades through the blood-red water, while heroic landing craft commanders violently rammed their wooden vessels directly onto the burning beaches, refusing to reverse their engines until their decks were absolutely, physically overflowing with the shattered, bleeding survivors of the catastrophic raid. But the agonizing, unforgiving mathematics of time and tide ultimately dictated a horrific, deeply tragic conclusion to the chaotic evacuation, forcing the Royal Navy to make the gut-wrenching, entirely ruthless decision to abandon the beaches to save the burning remnants of the fleet. As the absolute final, heavily damaged landing craft violently tore themselves away from the treacherous church shingles, leaving massive, suffocating plumes of thick black exhaust in their wake, a profound, terrifyingly heavy silence began to slowly descend upon the pulverized coastline of Dieppe. For the nearly 2,000 Canadian soldiers who were physically left behind, trapped between the towering, impenetrable chalk cliffs and the cold, retreating ocean, the terrifying realization of their absolute, undeniable abandonment violently crashed down upon their exhausted minds. Their ammunition pouches were completely, utterly empty, their radios were violently shattered, and the heavily armed, deeply entrenched German infantry units were now systematically, cautiously advancing down from their subterranean bunkers with bayonets fixed to execute the final, ruthless mopping-up operations. With absolutely zero avenues of escape, and completely devoid of any mathematical hope of reinforcement, the proud, fiercely defiant men of the 2nd Canadian Division were forced to endure the ultimate, suffocating humiliation of the mechanized battlefield. They slowly, agonizingly raised their hands into the smoke-filled air and surrendered to the fascist enemy. The immediate physical aftermath of the apocalyptic slaughter on the beaches of Dieppe was a deeply traumatizing, horrific spectacle that profoundly shocked even the battle-hardened, ruthless veterans of the German Wehrmacht. As the smoke finally slowly cleared from the picturesque French promenade, the German defenders stared down at a sprawling, deeply sickening carpet of twisted, burning steel and mutilated human flesh, marveling at the sheer, completely incomprehensible suicidal bravery of the young Commonwealth soldiers who had violently charged their impenetrable concrete fortresses. Nearly 3,000 surviving Canadian troops, stripped of their weapons, their dignity, and their naive illusions of battlefield glory, were aggressively rounded up by heavily armed SS guards and marched at gunpoint directly through the cobblestone streets of the exact same French town they had been explicitly ordered to liberate just hours prior. For these physically shattered, deeply traumatized young men, the agonizing, terrifying nightmare of the Dieppe Raid had violently ended, but a dark, suffocating, and entirely new psychological hell was just beginning as they were herded into tightly packed cattle cars and sent deep into the freezing, unforgiving heart of the Third Reich to endure years of brutal, systematic starvation and psychological torture as forgotten prisoners of war. When the heavily encrypted, blood-soaked radio transmissions finally ceased, and the violently shattered remnants of the Royal Navy Armada slowly limped back into the southern ports of England, a paralyzing, suffocating wave of absolute horror violently crashed down upon the subterranean corridors of Whitehall. Deep within the heavily fortified cabinet war rooms, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the fiercely ambitious Lord Louis Mountbatten were suddenly, physically confronted with the catastrophic, undeniable mathematical reality of their highly experimental military gamble. The initial, tragically optimistic reports that had briefly flooded the command centers earlier that morning, falsely suggesting that the Canadian vanguard had successfully breached the picturesque French town, were violently incinerated by the arrival of the actual stomach-churning casualty lists. Out of the roughly 5,000 magnificent, highly trained Canadian infantrymen who had bravely charged into the freezing surf of Operation Jubilee, over 900 were confirmed dead, and nearly 2,000 more had been violently swallowed by the fascist war machine as prisoners of war. In a matter of mere agonizing hours, an entire generation of Canada's brightest, most eager youth had been systematically, mechanically wiped from the geopolitical chessboard, completely obliterating the arrogant British assumption that a frontal assault against Hitler's Atlantic Wall could be achieved with nothing but surprise and raw infantry courage. Faced with an unprecedented apocalyptic public relations disaster that threatened to violently shatter the fragile, war-weary morale of the entire Allied coalition, the ruthless architects of the British High Command immediately initiated a massive, deeply cynical, and heavily coordinated propaganda campaign to systematically sanitize the slaughter. Churchill, operating with a cold, terrifyingly calculating political pragmatism, absolutely refused to publicly categorize the Dieppe Raid as a catastrophic, mathematically flawed military failure. Instead, the British government aggressively weaponized its powerful state media apparatus to meticulously rebrand the blood-soaked massacre as a highly successful, profoundly necessary reconnaissance in force or an indispensable, invaluable lesson in amphibious warfare. The Prime Minister explicitly broadcast to the panicked global public, and specifically to a deeply paranoid Joseph Stalin in Moscow, that the horrific sacrifice of the 2nd Canadian Division was an absolutely vital, highly calculated stepping stone required to violently unlock the heavily guarded tactical secrets of the German coastal defences. This sterile, deeply insulting bureaucratic spin deliberately minimized the agonizing, completely avoidable deaths of thousands of young men, callously transforming their mutilated corpses into nothing more than a necessary mathematical down payment for the eventual future liberation of the European continent. While the British propaganda machine desperately attempted to mathematically justify the bloodbath to a traumatized domestic audience, the deeply psychotic, highly efficient propaganda apparatus of the Third Reich capitalized on the mechanized slaughter with a terrifying, unadulterated and gleeful ferocity. Joseph Goebbels, the absolute mastermind of Nazi public manipulation, instantly recognized the catastrophic Allied failure at Dieppe as the ultimate indisputable vindication of Adolf Hitler's sprawling, heavily fortified fortress Europe. Within days of the massacre, the German Ministry of Public Enlightenment flooded the global press, neutral nations, and the occupied territories with heavily stylized, deeply sickening cinematic newsreels and high-resolution photographs showcasing the sprawling, burning wreckage on the French chert beaches. They broadcast terrifying high-contrast images of paralyzed, smoking Churchill tanks, massive piles of abandoned Lee Enfield rifles, and thousands of deeply traumatized, exhausted Canadian prisoners of war being marched at gunpoint through the cobblestone streets. For the Nazi regime, the violent repulsion of Operation Jubilee was an absolute mythological propaganda triumph, physically proving to the entire terrified world that any desperate, foolish attempt by the Western democracies to breach the impenetrable concrete of the Atlantic Wall would instantly, mathematically result in complete and total mechanized annihilation. Across the freezing, treacherous waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the horrifying news of the Dieppe massacre violently slammed into the Canadian capital of Ottawa like a catastrophic, profoundly agonizing, psychological earthquake. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and the deeply devastated Canadian public were plunged into a suffocating, blinding state of absolute, unmitigated national mourning, as almost every single town, village, and neighborhood across the vast country simultaneously received a deluge of terrifying black-bordered telegrams delivering the news of their slaughtered sons. But as the agonizing, heavily sanitized details of the operation slowly began to leak through the impenetrable fog of British military censorship, the profound, paralyzing grief of the Canadian nation rapidly, violently mutated into a blazing, deeply entrenched, and incredibly bitter geopolitical fury. Canadian military commanders and politicians began to stare directly at the catastrophic blueprints of Operation Jubilee in absolute paralyzing disbelief, demanding to know exactly why their magnificent, untested soldiers had been violently hurled against an impenetrable concrete fortress completely devoid of the massive, necessary preliminary naval bombardments or heavy aerial support that basic, fundamental military doctrine aggressively demanded. This profound, suffocating realization violently birthed a dark, enduring, and deeply toxic historical resentment that would fundamentally poison the Anglo-Canadian military relationship for decades following the conclusion of the Second World War. A terrifying, highly explosive narrative began to firmly take root within the traumatized Canadian national consciousness. The agonizing belief that the aristocratic, heavily entrenched British military establishment had intentionally, coldly viewed the eager troops of the Commonwealth as entirely disposable experimental cannon fodder. For the fiercely proud veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces and the deeply grieving families left behind, the cynical, mathematical justifications offered by Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten were completely, categorically unforgivable. They violently rejected the sterile notion that 3,000 brave young men had to be brutally, physically ground into the chert stones of a French beach simply to teach the British generals how to properly invade Europe, completely cementing the tragedy of Dieppe not as a heroic sacrifice, but as a catastrophic, deeply arrogant imperial betrayal that would permanently stain the blood-soaked legacy of the Allied High Command. Beneath the suffocating, heavily sanitized official narrative of a failed amphibious reconnaissance mission lies the absolute most explosive, highly classified, and profoundly disturbing conspiracy theory of the entire Second World War. For decades, military historians and traumatized veterans have stared at the catastrophic, mathematically suicidal blueprints of Operation Jubilee and violently refused to believe that the British High Command could have been completely, genuinely, that incompetent. A terrifying, labyrinthine counter-narrative has slowly emerged from the heavily redacted shadows of Whitehall, suggesting that the massive, blood-soaked frontal assault by the 2nd Canadian Division was never actually intended to successfully capture the port or hold the picturesque French town. Instead, this dark, stomach-churning theory aggressively posits that the agonizing slaughter of thousands of magnificent, untested infantrymen on the chert beaches of Dieppe was deliberately, coldly engineered as a colossal, highly visible, and violently noisy tactical diversion. The true, absolute objective of the raid was completely invisible to the dying Canadians, heavily concealed within the ruthless, highly compartmentalized world of British Naval Intelligence, aiming to execute a surgical, top-secret heist right under the noses of the distracted German war machine. The terrifying epicenter of this shadow operation revolved entirely around the agonizing, suffocating crisis currently paralyzing the brilliant codebreakers at Bletchley Park in the summer of 1942. The brilliant British mathematicians under Alan Turing had previously successfully cracked the standard German Enigma ciphers, but the terrifyingly efficient Kriegsmarine under Admiral Karl Dönitz had recently introduced a massive, catastrophic upgrade to their submarine communications. The 4-rotor M4 Enigma machine, utilizing the impenetrable Shark cipher. This sudden, mathematically devastating cryptographic blackout instantly blinded the British Admiralty, allowing the ruthless German U-boat wolf packs to violently, systematically annihilate the vital Allied merchant shipping convoys in the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean, effectively starving the British Isles to the absolute brink of total industrial collapse. Desperate to physically steal a 4-rotor Enigma machine, its highly classified operating manuals, and the priceless, deeply guarded daily setting sheets, Commander Ian Fleming, the brilliant, ruthless naval intelligence officer who would later author the legendary James Bond espionage novels, began architecting a highly experimental, incredibly audacious commando snatch-and-grab mission, specifically designated as a pinch operation. According to this highly explosive, deeply unsettling historical theory, Fleming's meticulously engineered pinch operation aggressively targeted a very specific, heavily guarded building located right in the heart of the picturesque French town, the Hôtel Moderne, which served as the absolute fortified operational headquarters for the German Naval Command in Dieppe. While the magnificent, heavily burdened Canadian infantrymen and the massive Churchill tanks were violently hurled directly into the impenetrable concrete meat grinder of the primary beaches, deliberately drawing the undivided apocalyptic fury of the German heavy artillery and infantry reserves, a highly specialized, absolutely secret unit of elite commandos, was supposed to silently infiltrate the town under the suffocating fog of war. This deeply classified snatch squad, operating completely independently from the doomed Canadian vanguard, was explicitly tasked with violently breaching the Hôtel Moderne, physically blowing open the heavily reinforced safes, stealing the priceless Enigma machine and the cryptographic rotors, and vanishing back into the English Channel before the heavily distracted German defenders even realized their absolute most guarded geopolitical secret had been compromised. If this terrifying, labyrinthine intelligence narrative is fundamentally true, it completely, violently transforms the tragic incompetence of Operation Jubilee into a cold, mathematically psychopathic calculation of ultimate, ruthless utilitarianism. It suggests that Lord Mountbatten, Ian Fleming, and potentially even Prime Minister Winston Churchill, sitting in the claustrophobic depths of the cabinet war rooms, looked at the catastrophic, blood-soaked blueprints of the Dieppe Raid and mathematically concluded that the agonizing deaths of 3,000 young Canadian soldiers was a completely acceptable, ruthlessly pragmatic geopolitical price to pay. In the terrifying, emotionless arithmetic of total war, trading a single infantry division on a French beach to successfully crack the four-rotor Enigma code would instantly, miraculously win the Battle of the Atlantic, permanently saving tens of thousands of Allied sailors and millions of tons of absolutely vital war materials from the suffocating depths of the ocean. The brave men of the 2nd Canadian Division were not sent to Dieppe to fight a winnable battle. They were cynically, deliberately sent to physically bleed to death on the razor-sharp chert stones, serving as nothing more than a massive, heavily armed distraction to successfully camouflage the absolute greatest intelligence heist of the 20th century. The absolute crushing tragedy of this dark, heavily classified espionage theory is that even if the Canadian infantry was deliberately, ruthlessly sacrificed as a violent tactical decoy, the top-secret pinch operation ended in a catastrophic, unmitigated failure that completely mirrored the apocalyptic slaughter on the beaches. The elite British commando unit explicitly tasked with penetrating the Hotel Moderne and securing the four-rotor Enigma machine was violently pinned down by the exact same impenetrable, overlapping fields of German machine gun fire that were currently exterminating the Canadian vanguard. The heavily fortified perimeter of the town was absolutely never breached. The brilliant, highly calculated snatch-and-grab heist completely evaporated into the choking black smoke of the burning Churchill tanks, and Ian Fleming was forced to watch his brilliant, desperate intelligence gamble mathematically collapse from the deck of a Royal Navy destroyer offshore. The priceless Enigma machine remained perfectly, securely locked inside the German headquarters, completely untouched, meaning the 3,000 magnificent Canadian soldiers who were violently ground into the French coastline had their blood spilled for absolutely nothing, their agonizing sacrifice securing neither the port of Dieppe nor the cryptographic salvation of the British Empire. As the suffocating black smoke finally began to clear from the pulverized, blood-soaked church shingles of the French coastline, the agonizing, undeniable reality of total tactical defeat violently crashed down upon the surviving remnants of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Stripped of their jammed Lee Enfield rifles, their shattered steel helmets, and their completely shattered illusions of glorious battlefield liberation, nearly 2,000 magnificent, heavily traumatized young men were forcefully rounded up by heavily armed German sentries. The battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, who had just spent the last 6 agonizing hours systematically, mathematically annihilating the Allied vanguard from the safety of their impenetrable concrete bunkers, now marched their exhausted, bleeding captives directly through the cobblestone streets of Dieppe at gunpoint. For these proud Canadian soldiers, who had aggressively trained for over 2 years in the muddy fields of England for exactly this monumental moment, the terrifying physical humiliation of raising their hands in surrender to the fascist enemy was a profound, deeply scarring psychological trauma. They were abruptly, violently transitioned from heroic, charging assault troops into entirely powerless, forgotten prisoners of the Third Reich, abandoned by their commanders and left completely to the merciless, cold-blooded whims of Adolf Hitler's sprawling military apparatus. The terrifying, agonizing descent into the suffocating abyss of Nazi captivity began almost immediately as the physically shattered, deeply traumatized Canadian survivors were aggressively herded into tightly packed pitch-black wooden cattle cars for a horrific mechanized journey deep into the freezing heart of Eastern Europe. Crammed together so tightly that men were physically incapable of sitting or laying down, the wounded, bleeding soldiers were forced to endure days of absolute, unmitigated physical torment, completely deprived of basic medical attention, food, or even clean drinking water. As the suffocating trains violently rattled across the war-torn European continent, transporting the doomed men toward the sprawling, heavily fortified prisoner-of-war camps known as stalags, the agonizing psychological weight of the Dieppe massacre began to heavily, completely crush their spirits. They were violently plagued by the terrifying, unanswerable questions of why their massive, heavily armored Churchill tanks had failed so catastrophically, why the promised aerial and naval bombardments had entirely evaporated, and whether the aristocratic British High Command had deliberately, cynically sacrificed their magnificent division for absolutely nothing. Upon arriving at brutal, freezing camps like Stalag the 8th B in Lambsdorff, the exhausted Canadians were violently thrust into a dark, highly regimented world of systematic starvation, forced labor, and endless, terrifying isolation from the civilized world. But the absolute most horrifying and deeply controversial chapter of their agonizing captivity violently erupted just weeks after the catastrophic raid, triggered by a highly explosive, fiercely contested diplomatic crisis known as the Shackle Directive. When the victorious German forces meticulously scoured the pulverized, blood-stained beaches of Dieppe, they discovered highly classified, heavily detailed operational orders explicitly instructing the Allied commandos to physically bind the hands of any captured German prisoners to prevent them from destroying vital documents. When these terrifying, completely illegal orders reached the Chancellery in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was consumed by a blinding, psychopathic, and uncontrollable apocalyptic fury, viewing the directive as a profound, unforgivable violation of international military law and the Geneva Convention. In a massive, ruthless, and highly publicized act of cold-blooded retaliatory vengeance, the Nazi dictator explicitly ordered the immediate, physical shackling of over 1,000 Canadian prisoners of war. For over a year, these magnificent, previously unbroken young men were violently forced to live, sleep, and work with their wrists tightly bound by heavy, freezing steel handcuffs or thick ropes, a terrifying, deeply humiliating psychological and physical torture that fundamentally separated the Dieppe survivors from virtually every other Allied prisoner in the entire European theater. The brutal, agonizing reality of daily existence within the claustrophobic, heavily guarded perimeters of the stalags was a terrifying, systematic war of absolute, unmitigated attrition against the human soul. Stripped of their dignity and constantly, violently harassed by the deeply paranoid, heavily armed German guards, the Canadian prisoners were deliberately, mathematically starved, surviving entirely on pathetic, heavily watered-down turnip soup and microscopic rations of rotting bread that barely sustained their rapidly deteriorating physical frames. During the suffocating, freezing winters, the men were forced to endure sub-zero temperatures with absolutely inadequate clothing, leading to terrifying outbreaks of pneumonia, dysentery, and severe malnutrition that systematically, ruthlessly claimed the lives of men who had miraculously survived the apocalyptic crossfire on the Chert beaches. Yet, in the absolute darkest depths of this mechanized fascist hellscape, the fiercely proud men of the 2nd Canadian Division forged an unbreakable, incredibly resilient brotherhood of absolute defiance, meticulously organizing highly classified, subterranean intelligence networks, executing brilliant, highly coordinated escape attempts, and stubbornly refusing to let the brutal, dehumanizing conditions of the camps completely extinguish their fundamental, unwavering humanity. As the agonizing, blood-soaked years of the Second World War slowly, violently dragged on toward the ultimate, apocalyptic collapse of the Third Reich, the forgotten Canadian prisoners of Dieppe were forced to watch from behind the razor wire as the massive, overwhelming industrial might of the Allied coalition finally successfully breached the Atlantic Wall at Normandy. For these heavily traumatized, physically shattered men, the glorious, heavily celebrated triumph of D-Day was deeply, profoundly bittersweet, a stark, agonizing reminder of the catastrophic, mathematically flawed experiment that had violently stolen their youth and slaughtered their closest friends 2 years prior. When the sprawling, freezing camps were finally violently liberated by the advancing Allied armies in the chaotic, apocalyptic spring of 1945, the surviving Canadians emerged as hollowed-out, deeply scarred ghosts of the magnificent, eager soldiers who had boarded the landing craft in the summer of 1942. Their terrifying, agonizing ordeal in the stalags remains one of the absolute darkest, most heavily overlooked, and profoundly tragic chapters of the entire Dieppe narrative, a terrifying testament to the horrific, enduring, and deeply personal price paid by the individual soldiers whose lives were ruthlessly, mathematically expended on the grand, unforgiving geopolitical chessboard of the Second World War. When the apocalyptic mechanized slaughter of the Second World War finally ground to a violent, suffocating halt across the pulverized, radioactive-looking ashes of the European continent, the deeply traumatized, physically shattered Canadian survivors of the Stalags were miraculously, systematically liberated by the advancing Allied armies and slowly transported back across the freezing Atlantic Ocean. As these hollowed-out, deeply scarred ghosts of the magnificent 2nd Canadian Infantry Division finally returned to the grieving, war-weary towns of their homeland, a profound, highly explosive, and deeply agonizing national reckoning violently erupted across the geopolitical landscape of Ottawa. The magnificent, heavily celebrated, and mathematically triumphant success of the 1944 Normandy landings had completely, undeniably proven that Adolf Hitler's sprawling, heavily fortified Atlantic wall could indeed be violently breached by a massive, highly coordinated amphibious assault. But for the grieving Canadian families and the furious, battle-hardened veterans, this glorious victory only violently magnified the catastrophic, completely incomprehensible tragedy of 1942, prompting a massive, relentless, and deeply bitter public demand to uncover exactly why their sons had been ruthlessly, mathematically slaughtered on the chert beaches of Dieppe, without the absolute, fundamental military support that was so meticulously provided to the D-Day invasion forces. Faced with an unprecedented, terrifyingly explosive historical inquisition that threatened to permanently, violently shatter their exalted, mythological wartime legacies, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the fiercely ambitious Lord Louis Mountbatten aggressively launched a massive, deeply cynical, and highly coordinated retrospective propaganda campaign. Operating with a cold, terrifyingly calculating political pragmatism, the aristocratic architects of the British High Command absolutely refused to apologize or publicly accept any fundamental, tactical responsibility for the catastrophic, blood-soaked military disaster. Instead, they meticulously, aggressively rebranded the horrific massacre of 3,000 young Canadian soldiers as an absolutely vital, highly calculated, and indispensable strategic stepping stone that directly, mathematically guaranteed the eventual liberation of Western Europe. Mountbatten, speaking with a breathtaking, deeply arrogant level of aristocratic detachment, infamously and coldly proclaimed to the traumatized global public that every single drop of Canadian blood violently spilled on the church shingles of Dieppe in 1942 explicitly, mathematically saved the lives of 10 Allied soldiers on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, a sterile, deeply insulting bureaucratic equation designed to completely sanitize a colossal military blunder. To mathematically anchor this deeply controversial, highly sanitized historical narrative, the British military establishment aggressively highlighted a very specific, heavily documented list of crucial tactical lessons that were allegedly exclusively extracted from the burning, pulverized wreckage of Operation Jubilee. They forcefully argued that the catastrophic failure of the paralyzed Churchill tanks directly inspired the brilliant, highly specialized armored engineering of Hobart's funnies, the modified vehicles that successfully violently dismantled the German concrete defenses on D-Day. Furthermore, they claimed the apocalyptic, uncontested slaughter of the Canadian infantry definitively proved to the Allied command structure that massive, overwhelming preliminary naval bombardments and heavy aerial saturation campaigns were absolutely, mathematically mandatory before launching any future amphibious assault. The British historians systematically codified the dark, suffocating tragedy of Dieppe as a necessary, horrific beta test, insisting that the arrogant, deeply flawed strategy of attempting to directly capture a heavily fortified, deep-water port via a frontal infantry charge was permanently, violently erased from the Allied playbook, entirely because the brave men of the 2nd Canadian Division had paid the ultimate, agonizing price to expose its fatal mathematical impossibility. However, for the deeply traumatized Canadian veterans and the relentless, highly skeptical modern military historians, this highly sanitized, meticulously constructed imperial justification is violently, categorically rejected as a profound, unforgivable insult to the memories of the slaughtered men. They aggressively argue that the fundamental basic military doctrines regarding the absolute necessity of overwhelming fire support and specialized amphibious armor were already widely known and extensively documented by competent military strategists long before the catastrophic summer of 1942. The furious, deeply entrenched Canadian counter-narrative posits that Mountbatten and the deeply arrogant British High Command did not require the agonizing mechanized slaughter of 3,000 magnificent Commonwealth troops simply to learn that a completely unsupported, unarmored frontal charge against heavily entrenched heavy artillery and rapid-fire machine guns would mathematically result in absolute annihilation. For these bitter, deeply grieving critics, the cynical post-war spin is nothing more than a desperate, cold-blooded geopolitical cover-up, meticulously engineered to completely shield incompetent aristocratic British commanders from facing the terrifying, apocalyptic consequences of their own staggering mathematical hubris. Ultimately, the agonizing, deeply controversial historical reckoning of the Dieppe Raid completely and violently fractured the romanticized, unified mythology of the Allied war effort, leaving a dark, suffocating, and permanent psychological scar directly across the Anglo-Canadian diplomatic relationship. While the heroic, triumphant veterans of the Normandy landings are universally, globally celebrated as the glorious, immovable saviors of Western democracy, the forgotten, physically shattered victims of Operation Jubilee remain tragically suspended in a terrifying, heavily debated geopolitical purgatory. The sprawling, beautifully manicured military cemeteries overlooking the picturesque French coastline, where hundreds of white Canadian tombstones stand in silent, agonizing formation, serve as a profound, chilling physical monument to a terrifyingly ruthless era of mechanized warfare where human lives were completely, callously treated as expendable mathematical data points. The brutal, unforgiving legacy of Dieppe forces the modern observer to confront the darkest, most stomach-churning reality of the Second World War. The terrifying realization that the good war was occasionally commanded by deeply flawed, heavily arrogant men perfectly willing to blindly hurl their closest allies into an impenetrable concrete meat grinder to cover up their own catastrophic strategic inadequacies. As the relentless, unforgiving tides of the English Channel slowly washed the freezing, blood-stained church shingles of the French coastline clean over the ensuing decades, the physical, twisted wreckage of Operation Jubilee was gradually swallowed by the sea, but the profound, agonizing psychological scars inflicted upon the Canadian national consciousness remained permanently, violently open. The majestic, terrifyingly pristine white chalk cliffs of Dieppe, which had stared down with absolute godlike indifference as thousands of magnificent young men were systematically, mechanically slaughtered at their base, stand today as a suffocating, deeply haunting monument to one of the most catastrophic military blunders in modern human history. For the grieving, shattered communities across the vast expanse of Canada, who received nothing but cold, heavily sanitized, black-bordered telegrams explaining the sudden, violent evaporation of an entire generation, the passage of time fundamentally failed to dilute the blazing, deeply entrenched fury directed toward the aristocratic British High Command. The magnificent 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was not defeated in a fair, mathematically balanced tactical engagement. They were violently, callously hurled into an impenetrable, heavily fortified concrete meat grinder completely devoid of the massive, necessary preliminary bombardments that basic military doctrine absolutely demanded, transforming their heroic, unarmored charge into a deeply tragic, entirely avoidable, mechanized mass execution. When forced to stare directly into the terrifying, labyrinthine shadows of the highly classified espionage theories that surround the massacre, the modern historical observer is violently plunged into an agonizing, deeply uncomfortable moral abyss regarding the true, unvarnished nature of Allied strategic operations. If the brilliant, cold-blooded architects of British Naval Intelligence, including the legendary Ian Fleming, genuinely and deliberately orchestrated the apocalyptic slaughter of the Canadian vanguard simply to serve as a colossal, noisy, and blood-soaked tactical diversion for a top-secret Enigma machine heist, it fundamentally redefines the entire moral architecture of the Second World War. This terrifying, highly explosive narrative suggests a level of calculated psychopathic utilitarianism where Winston Churchill and Lord Mountbatten looked at the magnificent, eager Commonwealth troops and mathematically concluded that their agonizing deaths were a completely acceptable, ruthlessly pragmatic geopolitical transaction required to win the Battle of the Atlantic. The sheer staggering horror of Dieppe is violently magnified by the terrifying possibility that these brave men were not the tragic victims of arrogant military incompetence, but rather the deliberate, highly compartmentalized casualties of a brilliant, completely ruthless intelligence gamble that catastrophically failed to secure its ultimate prize, leaving thousands of young soldiers to bleed to death on the chert stones for absolutely nothing. The deeply cynical, heavily coordinated post-war propaganda campaign explicitly designed to sanitize the Dieppe massacre and mathematically justify the slaughter as the indispensable, bleeding stepping stone for the triumphant 1944 Normandy landings remains one of the most profoundly insulting, heavily contested historical narratives of the 20th century. Lord Louis Mountbatten, operating with a breathtaking, deeply arrogant level of aristocratic self-preservation, absolutely refused to face the terrifying, apocalyptic consequences of his own staggering hubris, coldly dictating to the traumatized global public that the massive Canadian sacrifice was an absolutely vital, necessary evil that directly purchased the eventual liberation of the European continent. But for the physically shattered, deeply traumatized veterans who miraculously survived the agonizing hell of the Stalags and the furious, relentless military historians who continue to meticulously dissect the catastrophic blueprints of Operation Jubilee, this sterile, bureaucratic justification is violently, categorically rejected as a desperate, cold-blooded imperial cover-up. They aggressively argue that the fundamental, blindingly obvious military requirement for heavy naval and aerial bombardment before launching a frontal amphibious assault did not require the mechanized butchery of 3,000 men to be mathematically proven, completely cementing the legacy of the British commanders not as brilliant, forward-thinking strategists, but as dangerously incompetent gamblers, perfectly willing to risk the lives of their allies to mask their own failures. Ultimately, the dark, blood-soaked history of the Dieppe Raid systematically and violently dismantles the comforting, deeply romanticized and heavily sanitized mythological narrative of the good war that the victorious Allied nations have aggressively propagated for over 8 decades. It forces the uncomfortable, deeply agonizing realization that the monumental global crusade to entirely eradicate the mechanized terror of fascism from the European continent was occasionally orchestrated by deeply flawed, heavily arrogant men who completely viewed human lives as expendable, disposable data points on a sprawling, unforgiving geopolitical chessboard. The magnificent, heavily celebrated triumphs of D-Day and the liberation of Paris are inextricably, permanently linked to the suffocating, terrifying tragedy of August 19, 1942, a stark, agonizing reminder that the absolute, staggering cost of global freedom was often paid in the currency of unnecessary, catastrophic military blunders and deeply cynical intelligence operations. The rust-covered, silent remnants of the Churchill tanks, buried beneath the shifting church shingles, serve as a permanent, chilling testament to the horrific, enduring price paid by the individual soldiers who were ruthlessly, mathematically fed into the gaping maw of the German war machine, completely stripped of their agency and their futures by the arrogant decisions made in the claustrophobic, subterranean bunkers of London. As we look back across the freezing, treacherous waters of the English Channel at the blood-stained beaches and the towering chalk cliffs, we are left staring at one of the absolute most agonizing, fiercely debated, and completely unforgettable historical controversies of the Second World War. We are violently forced to confront the terrifying, unanswerable questions that continue to deeply haunt the military archives and the traumatized memories of the surviving families to this very day. Was the apocalyptic slaughter of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division simply the tragic, unavoidable result of staggering, aristocratic British military incompetence, or were these brave, magnificent men deliberately, coldly sacrificed as heavily armed experimental guinea pigs to camouflage the absolute greatest, most ruthless intelligence heist of the 20th century? Let me know exactly what you believe happened in the dark, blood-soaked shadows of Operation Jubilee down in the comments. Below, hit that subscribe button to join our relentless pursuit of unfiltered historical truth, and I will see you in the next dark chapter of history.